A thug struck a royal guard's ribs with a metal pipe, expecting him to flinch, but he didn't move an inch. Then he made a critical mistake. He went for a second hit. And in that moment, something happened that silenced the entire crowd. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow at the same time we'll bring you another story of courage and discipline from the Royal Guards that you won't want to miss. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard at Windsor Castle as tourists gathered to admire the iconic Royal Guard on duty. Guard James Wilson stood motionless at his post, scarlet uniform immaculate, bearskin cap perfectly aligned, ceremonial rifle held with unwavering precision. His eyes, fixed forward in the 1,000-yard stare, perfected through months of training, betrayed nothing of the decorated soldier behind the ceremonial facade. For 6 hours, Wilson had maintained his position with the discipline that had carried him through 2 tours in Afghanistan and specialized training with Britain's most elite military units. Each button on his uniform gleamed in the late afternoon light, polished to perfection through hours of meticulous preparation before dawn. What tourists saw as a ceremonial figure was, in reality, an active duty soldier whose service record would have commanded respect in any military circle around the world. The peaceful atmosphere shattered as a group of 5 young men rounded the corner, their loud voices and aggressive posturing immediately setting them apart from the respectful tourists. Their leader, a muscular man in his mid-20s with cropped hair and a jagged scar across his right cheek, carried a length of metal pipe that he tapped rhythmically against his palm as he approached. "Look at this, lads," Marcus Fletcher announced, his London accent thick with contempt as he gestured toward Wilson. "Another one of the Queen's toy soldiers." The metal pipe gleamed dully as he swung it in a casual arc, too close to passing tourists for comfort, standing there like a bloody statue while normal people pay their taxes. The other tourists began to notice the disruption, parents pulling children closer, elderly couples stepping back, a sense of unease rippling through the previously relaxed atmosphere. A mother hurried her young son away, whispering urgent instructions as the boy looked back with wide eyes. "Betty thinks he's something special," Marcus continued, stepping closer to Wilson, deliberately invading the space most visitors instinctively respected. All dressed up with nowhere to go. He circled the guard slowly, the metal pipe now tapping against his thigh with each step. "What do you think, boys? Think he's deaf as well as dumb?" His companions laughed on cue, spreading out to form a loose semicircle. The tourists had now created a wide berth around the developing scene, many looking around anxiously for security personnel. "You know what I hate about these guards?" Marcus's voice rose, clearly performing now for his audience of uncomfortable onlookers. "The way they look down on regular people, standing there all high and mighty with their fancy hats and shiny buttons." His face twisted with unexpected bitterness. "Like they're better than the rest of us." An elderly man wearing a veteran's pin stepped forward from the crowd, his face lined with concern. "Young man, perhaps you should mind your own business, Grandad," Marcus cut him off, pointing the pipe in the veteran's direction. "Unless you want trouble too." The threat hung in the air, clear and unmistakable. The veteran hesitated, decades of courage warring with the wisdom of age, before reluctantly stepping back. His eyes, however, remained fixed on Wilson, a silent communication between servicemen that transcended generations. Marcus turned his attention back to Wilson, moving close enough that his breath fogged the brass buttons of the guard's uniform. "Not going to say anything, soldier boy? Not going to defend yourself?" He leaned in, voice dropping to a stage whisper intended for the crowd to hear. "Or maybe you can't. Maybe all that training just turned you into what you look like, a bloody mannequin." Something dangerous flickered in Marcus's eyes as Wilson maintained his perfect stillness. To most observers, the guard appeared unmoved, but to the trained eye, like the veteran watching from the crowd, there were subtle signs of preparation, the almost imperceptible shift in weight distribution, the minute tightening of fingers on the ceremonial rifle, the focused awareness that came from years of combat experience. "You see," Marcus addressed the crowd now, swinging the pipe in wider arcs, "people like him are the problem. They think a uniform makes them special." Each word carried the weight of old grievances, personal wounds festering beneath the surface bravado. "My old man wore a uniform too, prison guard, liked to throw his weight around, just like these toy soldiers." The pipe's movement became more aggressive, cutting through the air with increasing speed. Always talking about respect, always demanding respect. Marcus's face darkened with each word. "But what about respect for regular people, eh? What about that?" A young couple with a baby stroller hurried away from the scene, the woman casting a worried glance over her shoulder. Several tourists had their phones out now, not taking the usual tourist photos, but recording what everyone sensed was a situation spiralling toward violence. Marcus stepped even closer to Wilson. The pipe now held loosely in his hand, like a coiled snake ready to strike. "I wonder what it would take," he mused, voice dropping to a dangerous register, "to make him move, to make him show he's human after all." His eyes narrowed as he studied Wilson's impassive face. "What do you reckon, lads? Should we find out?" "Go on, Marcus, show him who's boss," urged Damon, the wiry member of the group who seemed most eager for trouble. His eyes darted between Marcus and the surrounding tourists, clearly enjoying the fear their presence was generating. "Bet that fancy uniform doesn't make him bulletproof." Marcus circled guard Wilson more deliberately now, studying him with the calculated menace of a predator sizing up its prey. The metal pipe twirled between his fingers with practiced ease, betraying experience with weapons that went beyond mere posturing. The afternoon light caught the jagged scratch marks along its length, evidence that this wasn't the pipe's first appearance in a confrontation. "You know what's funny?" Marcus addressed the increasingly tense crowd. "They stand here guarding what? Some old buildings? Some fancy jewels?" The pipe tapped against his palm with each point. "Meanwhile, people like me grew up in estates where no one stood guard, where no one protected anything." His companions had spread out further now, effectively blocking the most direct escape routes for nearby tourists. A teenage girl pulled out her phone to call for help, only to have Damon shake his head at her slowly, his smile promising consequences if she completed the call. She lowered the phone, eyes wide with fear. 15 years ago," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a strained quality, "my mum got mugged right outside our flat. Where were the fancy guards then? Where were the men in red coats?" The pipe's movement became more erratic, matching the growing intensity in his voice. "Nowhere, because they only protect what matters to the rich, to the powerful." An American tourist, a burly man in his 50s who clearly misjudged the situation, stepped forward with hands raised placatingly. "Hey, buddy, come on, this is a historic site. People are just trying to—" In one fluid motion, Marcus swung the pipe toward the tourist, stopping it just inches from the man's face. "Back off," he hissed, "unless you want to be part of the history of this place." The American retreated quickly, his wife pulling him back into the crowd with frantic whispers. The veteran who had attempted to intervene earlier had managed to position himself near a young family, subtly guiding them toward the periphery of the scene. His eyes never left Wilson, and in them was a recognition. The old soldier could see what the tourists couldn't. Behind Wilson's ceremonial stillness was a coiled readiness that came from real combat experience. "I did some checking up on these guards," Marcus announced, now playing directly to his audience. "Most of them are actual soldiers. Been in Iraq, Afghanistan, places like that." His voice took on a mocking tone. "Supposed to be tough guys, right? Fighting for Queen and country?" He spat on the ground near Wilson's perfectly polished boots. "But look at him now, standing there taking it while I insult everything he stands for." Two security guards had appeared at the edge of the courtyard, assessing the situation with growing concern. But they hesitated, clearly unprepared for the level of aggression on display. Marcus noticed them and laughed. "Look, boys, the real security has arrived." He gestured with the pipe toward the guards. "Regular blokes doing a regular job. Not too good to talk to us common folk, are they?" His attention swung back to Wilson, whose perfect stillness seemed to further inflame Marcus's anger. Not like this one, hiding behind tradition so he doesn't have to deal with reality. One of Marcus's companions, a heavy-set man with crude tattoos covering his forearms, pulled out a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey and took a long pull before offering it to Marcus. "Liquid courage, mate," he suggested with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Marcus accepted the bottle, drinking deeply without taking his eyes off Wilson. The whiskey seemed to fuel the fire of his resentment, his movements becoming more exaggerated as he handed the bottle back. "You know what I learned growing up?" he asked, addressing Wilson directly now. "I learned that men in uniforms think they're untouchable, think they can do whatever they want and hide behind their badges, their ranks, their fancy hats." The metal pipe began tapping against the stone ground, each impact sending a sharp, metallic echo across the courtyard. The rhythm increased, matching Marcus's escalating emotions. "My old man, the prison guard, liked to use his baton at work, then come home and use his fists, always talking about discipline, about respect." His voice cracked slightly. But where was his discipline? Where was his bloody respect? The veteran had managed to signal to another older man in the crowd, another former serviceman, by the subtle exchange of nods. They had begun quietly coordinating the movement of tourists away from the immediate vicinity, creating more space around the volatile scene. "I wonder," Marcus said, his voice now dangerously quiet as he moved within inches of Wilson's face, "if you're any different from him, all you uniformed types, so high and mighty." The pipe now rested against his shoulder like a baseball bat prepared for a swing. "Do they teach you to look through people like we don't exist? Or does that come naturally with the job?" Wilson's eyes remained fixed forward, showing no reaction to the increasingly personal taunts. But there was something in his bearing, a subtle tension, visible only to those who knew what to look for, that spoke of years of real combat experience, of discipline forged in circumstances far more threatening than a belligerent civilian with a pipe. "I think," Marcus announced, his voice rising again as he addressed his audience, "it's time we found out what it takes to make one of these toy soldiers remember they're actually human." He turned back to Wilson, moving the pipe from his shoulder to hold it in both hands. "What do you say, soldier boy? Ready to show us all what's behind the mask?" The security guards had begun cautiously approaching, one of them speaking into his radio with urgent, hushed tones. But they were still too far away to intervene quickly. A hush fell over the courtyard as Marcus took a step back, measuring the distance between himself and the guard with calculating eyes. The metal pipe glinted in the late afternoon sun, held now with purpose rather than casual threat. The moment stretched, tourists frozen in horrified anticipation. Marcus's companions leaning forward eagerly, the security guards quickening their pace but still too far away. "Let's see how much that fancy training is really worth," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a whisper as he tightened his grip on the pipe. His eyes narrowed, focusing on Wilson's midsection. "Let's see what it takes to break a royal guard." The pipe whistled through the air with shocking speed, a brutal arc aimed directly at Wilson's ribs. The sickening crack of metal against the guard's torso echoed across the suddenly silent courtyard, causing several tourists to cry out in horror. The impact would have doubled over most men, but Wilson remained impossibly upright, his posture rigid despite what must have been excruciating pain. "See that?" Marcus crowed, triumphant as he circled back, pipe held aloft. "Not so special now, are you?" A thin smile spread across his scarred face as he noted the lack of response. "Still playing soldier? Let's try again." The crowd had retreated further, forming a horrified circle around the scene. A woman was openly sobbing, clutching her husband's arm as he tried unsuccessfully to shield her view. Children were being hurried away, parents' faces tight with fear and outrage. The security guards had broken into a run now, but they were still precious seconds away from reaching the confrontation. "I hit him!" Marcus announced to his friends, a manic edge entering his voice. "Hit a royal guard, and he just stands there and takes it." He tapped the pipe against his palm, considering his next move. What does that tell you about how much this all means? Just a man in a costume, afraid to break character, even when someone puts him in his place. The veteran in the crowd had moved closer, his weathered face set with grim determination. "That's enough, son," he called out, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command. "You've made your point. Now step away before you make this worse." Marcus whirled toward the interruption, pipe pointed like an accusing finger. "Worse? For who? Him?" He gestured back at Wilson. "He's not even human enough to defend himself, just a robot following orders." His attention returned to the guard, whose breathing had become slightly more controlled, the only visible sign of the pain he must be enduring. Or maybe he's just a coward underneath all that red wool. One of Marcus's friends, the youngest of the group, began to look uncomfortable. "Marcus, mate, maybe that's enough. We've had our fun." "Fun?" Marcus cut him off, eyes wild now with something deeper than mere troublemaking. "This isn't about fun. This is about showing everyone what these uniforms really mean. Nothing." He spat the word, years of personal grievance distilled into that single syllable. They stand here pretending to be something special while real people suffer. Well, not today. The pipe rose again, this time aimed higher, at Wilson's head. The crowd gasped collectively, several people shouting warnings, others turning away, unable to watch the impending violence. The security guards were running flat out now, but they were still too far to prevent what was coming. "Let's see if that fancy hat protects your skull," Marcus snarled, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as he prepared to swing. "Let's find out what the Queen's finest is really made of." The pipe began its deadly arc toward Wilson's head, cutting through the air with a sound like tearing silk. Time seemed to slow down as the metal weapon approached the guard's temple, a blow that could potentially be fatal, but it never landed. In a movement so swift, it appeared almost supernatural to the watching crowd. Wilson's right hand shot up and caught the pipe mid-swing, stopping it with a grip of steel just inches from his face. The sudden action, after hours of perfect stillness, was so shocking that a collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief, his confidence evaporating as he found himself unable to move the pipe even an inch against Wilson's grip. He pulled harder, then tried to twist it free, but it was like trying to remove a sword from stone. The guard's white-gloved fingers hadn't just stopped the weapon, they had rendered it completely immobile. For the first time since the confrontation began, Wilson's eyes moved, shifting from their ceremonial forward gaze to lock directly onto Marcus's face. There was nothing ceremonial in that look. It carried the weight of real battlefield experience, of life and death decisions made under fire, of a discipline forged through far more than palace drills. "I believe," Wilson said, his voice quiet yet carrying across the now silent courtyard, "that's quite enough." The silence that followed was absolute. Birds seemed to stop singing. The crowd's breathing became collectively held. Even the wind appeared to pause as the full impact of the moment registered. A royal guard had broken protocol, had moved, had spoken. And the authority in those 4 simple words made it clear that everything was about to change. Marcus tried once more to pull the pipe free, his face contorting with effort, but Wilson's grip remained unbreakable. Fear began to replace anger in the young troublemaker's eyes as he realized, too late, that he had catastrophically misjudged the situation. "You hit me with a pipe," Wilson continued, his voice remaining measured despite the circumstances. "That was your first mistake." His eyes hadn't left Marcus's face, holding him in place as effectively as his grip on the weapon. "Assuming I wouldn't respond was your second." The guard's next movement was another marvel of controlled precision. Without releasing the pipe, he pivoted slightly, using Marcus's own momentum and a subtle shift of balance to send the younger man stumbling forward, off balance and vulnerable. In the same fluid motion, Wilson twisted the pipe from Marcus's grasp with such practiced ease that it seemed to simply transfer ownership, now held firmly in the guard's white-gloved hand. Marcus regained his footing and backed away, hands raised, the swagger completely gone from his bearing. His friends had already begun retreating, loyalty evaporating in the face of real consequences. The security guards had finally arrived but now stood back, recognizing that Wilson had control of the situation. "The third mistake," Wilson said, examining the pipe with calm detachment before placing it deliberately on the ground beside him, "was assuming that standing guard here means we're merely for show." Wilson stepped forward with military precision, the movement so sharp and controlled it made Marcus flinch. The guard's posture remained impeccable, despite the blow he'd absorbed minutes earlier. "Let me educate you about who stands before you," Wilson said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of command. He removed his white glove with deliberate care, then unbuttoned the high collar of his scarlet tunic just enough to reveal a glimpse of what lay beneath, a jagged scar that ran from his collarbone toward his shoulder. "Helmand Province, 2013. RPG attack on our forward operating base." The crowd remained utterly silent, the atmosphere charged with a tension entirely different from moments before. This wasn't fear, but reverence, the collective recognition that they were witnessing something profound. "Before I earned the right to wear this uniform," Wilson continued, rebuttoning his collar with precision, "I served 3 tours in active combat zones. The men and women who stand guard here aren't playing dress-up, Mr. Fletcher." The use of Marcus's surname caused the young man's eyes to widen in surprise. "Yes, we know who you are. Security briefed us on local troublemakers before my shift began." Marcus swallowed hard, his earlier bravado replaced by growing realization of the situation he'd created. The scarred guard before him was nothing like what he'd expected. Not a ceremonial figure, but a battle-hardened soldier whose discipline extended to absorbing a blow that would have felled most men. "This uniform," Wilson gestured to his scarlet tunic, "has been earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Every guard you see standing post has qualified through active military service. Many of us bear scars you can't see, from battles you'll never know about." He paused, his eyes sweeping the gathered crowd before returning to Marcus. "We stand motionless, not because we're weak, but because we've been taught that true strength lies in discipline, in control, in channeling aggression to only when absolutely necessary and appropriate." Wilson picked up his ceremonial rifle, which he had placed aside during the confrontation. The movement was fluid, practiced, and carried unmistakable meaning to anyone with military knowledge. This wasn't theatrical, it was muscle memory born from real combat experience. "The bearskin cap you mocked weighs 1.5 kilograms. We wear it in all weather, standing guard for hours without movement, without complaint. Not for show, but because it represents a tradition of service that stretches back centuries. Service to ideals larger than ourselves." He turned slightly, addressing not just Marcus now, but the entire crowd. "Every button on this tunic is polished by hand. Every crease is meticulously pressed. Not out of vanity, but out of respect for those who wore it before us and gave their lives in its service." The veteran who had tried to intervene earlier nodded slowly, pride evident in his weathered face. Other tourists stood transfixed, many recording the moment on their phones, but with a newfound reverence, understanding they were witnessing something historically significant. "You spoke of your father," Wilson said, turning back to Marcus, his tone softening slightly. "I cannot answer for his actions or the pain he caused you. But I can tell you this. A uniform doesn't make the man. The man brings either honor or disgrace to the uniform." Marcus's face worked through conflicting emotions. Anger still visible, but now tempered with uncertainty, with the first glimmers of understanding. "The reason I didn't react when you struck me," Wilson continued, "wasn't fear or weakness. It was because my duty here represents something greater than my personal comfort or pride. I'm trained to assess real threats, to distinguish between those who need correction and those who need understanding." He glanced at the metal pipe still lying on the ground, then back to Marcus's face. "You needed both." The security guards had positioned themselves behind Marcus now, ready to take him into custody, but Wilson raised a hand, asking them to wait. "I could press charges for assault," he said, his voice carrying no vindictiveness, only calm statement of fact. "That pipe could have done serious damage, particularly aimed at my head. But before these officers take you away, I want you to understand something." Wilson straightened to his full height, his bearing commanding complete attention. "I stand here not just as a guard of buildings or symbols, but as a guardian of principles, of a society where disagreements aren't settled with metal pipes, where uniforms, when worn with honor, represent service rather than oppression." He stepped closer to Marcus, whose defiance had crumbled into something closer to shame. "Your anger at your father's abuse of authority is justified, but transferring that anger to every uniform you see isn't healing your wounds, it's deepening them." For the first time, tears welled in Marcus's eyes, the facade of toughness giving way to the pain beneath. "He wore a uniform like it made him better than everyone," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "Made him better than my mum, better than me." "A uniform doesn't elevate anyone," Wilson replied gently. "It's a responsibility, not a privilege. Those who use it to feel superior have missed its entire meaning." Wilson returned to his ceremonial stance, rifle positioned precisely. "The man who stands guard here isn't a robot or a statue. He's someone who has already proven his courage in places you'll never see, fighting battles that never made the evening news. The stillness you mock represents a discipline you've never had to develop because you've never faced the challenges that require it." He nodded to the security guards, who moved forward to take Marcus into custody. "I hope someday you find a purpose worth standing for, Mr. Fletcher, something that demands the best of you rather than the worst." As the guards led Marcus away, Wilson had one final thing to add. "And if you do find that purpose, that thing worth sacrificing for, remember this moment. Remember that strength isn't measured by how hard you can swing a pipe, but by how firmly you can stand for what matters, even when it costs you." Wilson turned back to his post, resuming his ceremonial stance with perfect precision. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The elderly veteran approached slowly, stopping at a respectful distance from Wilson's post. He offered no words, just a crisp salute that spoke volumes between servicemen. Wilson's eyes remained forward in ceremonial precision, but a nearly imperceptible nod acknowledged the gesture between brothers in arms. Parents who had shielded their children during the confrontation now brought them forward, explaining in hushed, reverent tones what they had witnessed. "That's what real courage looks like," one father told his wide-eyed son. "Standing for something bigger than yourself, even when it's difficult." Phones were still raised for photographs, but the typical jokes about making the guard move or smile had disappeared. Instead, many visitors stood in respectful silence, contemplating the deeper meaning behind the ceremonial uniform. "I've never seen anything like it," an American tourist told the officer, taking her statement. "The restraint he showed, the dignity. It completely changed how I understand what these guards represent." The murmurs of the crowd gradually faded as people processed what they had just witnessed. Some had arrived expecting nothing more than a routine display of ceremonial duty, yet they were leaving with a newfound respect for the men who stood guard. The unwavering discipline of Guard Wilson had not only de-escalated a dangerous situation, but had also left a lasting impression on those who had seen true strength in action. What lessons can we take from this encounter between a troubled young man and a dedicated royal guard? Perhaps it reminds us that true strength isn't found in aggression, but in restraint. That uniforms don't make the person. It's the person who brings either honor or disgrace to the uniform they wear. Most importantly, it teaches us that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most powerful messages. Guard Wilson didn't need shouting or excessive force to command respect. His dignity and measured response spoke volumes about the values he represented. Has there been a moment in your life when you witnessed true strength demonstrated through restraint rather than force? Do you think our society properly values the discipline and dedication of those who serve in uniform, whether military or civilian? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about honor, duty, and respect. The bell icon will ensure you never miss our latest uploads, and check out our recommended videos appearing on your screen right now.